Steve. Today I'm joined by Sander Duncanson, partner with Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Now, there's much talk about the inevitability of transitioning to cleaner energy and reducing our dependence on carbon fuels. How would you describe the rate of transition so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from my perspective, the transition has been quite rapid. Probably not as rapid as some might have hoped, but it has been quite rapid. Transitioning towards a net zero carbon future will require significant changes all along all parts of the energy value chain. So from the energy production and generation side through to transportation and ultimately consumption. And we're talking many billions, if not trillions of dollars of existing infrastructure. So to make the types of transition that are being talked about happen, that's going to require potentially repurposing significant existing infrastructure, and it will require new technologies to allow this all to happen. And we're seeing that, particularly with the new technologies. We're seeing companies and governments across the country endorsing the need for energy transition and investing in those types of new technologies. But when we're talking about the pace of energy transition, I think we need to recognize that a transition fully away from carbon-based energy sources is still many years away. And in my view, carbon-based energy sources can be and should be an important part of how we achieve our country's climate objectives.
What are the greatest challenges that businesses face as they try to pivot from use of exploitative traditional energy sources towards renewable and next generation sources?
I think there's lots of challenges. Again, you're dealing with companies that in many cases, have billions of dollars of sunk investments in infrastructure that may now need to be repurposed. And this transition may take companies away from areas where they have significant longstanding expertise into new areas where they have very limited expertise and very few others have significant expertise. And so there's a lot of financial and legal risk that come with changing those types of investment and growth strategies. I expect, as a lawyer, not a business person, I can only imagine how difficult and risky those types of business decisions would be. And I would certainly advise companies going through that type of a shift to give those types of shifts careful consideration and make sure that they are obtaining support from legal and financial advisors who have specific experience in those areas.
What can provincial and federal governments do to quicken the pace of the transition to cleaner fuels?
Well, I think there's already quite a lot being done. Particularly the federal government, the current federal government in Canada, has provided a number of financial incentives for companies to engage in various aspects of this energy transition. Provincial governments have as well to a lesser degree. Certainly, further financial incentives may help increase the pace of the transition even more. But one of the key issues that I'm seeing, my practice is in regulatory, environmental, and indigenous law. And one of the key issues that we're seeing in my space right now is that the regulatory and tax frameworks that exist today don't adequately address some of these new technologies and new developments. And that, in some cases, is impeding development. So one way that I think that governments could help with the energy transition and further increase the pace of investments into energy transition would be to update certain regulatory and tax frameworks. And one example of that, some of the new technologies that we're seeing in Western Canada right now that are getting a lot of attention are blue hydrogen, geothermal, and to a somewhat lesser extent, petrolithium. Those activities are taking place right now under the existing regulatory frameworks, but those regulatory frameworks they're not ideal for those technologies because they weren't specifically contemplating those new technologies when they were developed. So to the extent that governments can provide regulatory clarity for those types of new technologies, that would certainly help facilitate new investment.
What will be the impact of environmental and indigenous laws in transitioning to cleaner energy?
Well, that's a great question because that's the area that I work in. What we've seen over the last number of years in Canada is that environmental and indigenous and regulatory risks associated with environmental laws and indigenous laws and the timing associated with getting projects through the regulatory process, those are some of the largest risks now to new project development in Canada. And in my experience, those risks can be successfully managed in most cases. But as a country, we have struggled in recent years to attract investment in the energy and large infrastructure sectors because of the perception that Canada has now as having these significant regulatory risks. And in my view, while there's been talk about things to improve those risks and mitigate those risks, by and large, those risks still remain today. And when you're looking at the energy transition, again, that transition, if it actually goes where some people are talking about going, that's going to require significant new large-scale infrastructure in Canada. And those types of projects, they will trigger the same types of regulatory, indigenous, environmental laws and risks that other large-scale infrastructure projects have in recent years and that have been very challenging. So I do think that how businesses and how governments manage those risks will likely be one of the key factors in how well Canada succeeds in this energy transition.
And what advice do you have for any clients in this area seeking to be proactive and risk averse?
Well, I think first off, my advice would be to invest in dedicated internal resources to understand where opportunities might arise within your particular business, and then to work with financial and legal advisors to assess the specific risks associated with those opportunities. What I've seen is that in many cases, you may be able to advance certain initiatives without committing material capital at the same time as governments are advancing the regulatory and tax initiatives on their end to make those opportunities actually make sense. And to the extent that the new opportunities are dependent on government funding or financial incentives to make economic sense, again, you can advance those initiatives to a certain extent until such time as that funding is in place. And what I've seen in the last months and over the last year is that the companies who did begin exploring opportunities early, even when there were many uncertainties around those opportunities, those companies are now at the forefront of the energy transition because those companies have helped shape the government incentives and initiatives that have been rolled out. And those companies also have the projects that are the farthest advanced and therefore the most likely to secure government funding and private capital. So what I've seen is that it may pay to be proactive even in the face of uncertainty.
How important is it for lawyers to specialize in energy law? What overlap is there with other areas of law, intellectual property, tax, etc.?
So when I started my career and when I was in law school, the term energy law was sort of synonymous with oil and gas law, particularly transactional law, and that's changed. The term energy law can now encompass a whole lot of different things, including renewable energies, including alternative energies, including various different disciplines that are now sort of at the forefront of advancing those types of energy projects. So transactional, of course, is still a part of that, but my practice area is now considered energy law, whereas it wouldn't have been maybe a decade ago. So regulatory, environmental, indigenous. Project finance is now a big part of it. And as you mentioned, tax and intellectual property. So, I mean, I guess the term energy law, from what I'm seeing, is less specific. But at the same time, that doesn't mean lawyers are becoming more kind of generalists and less specialized. I think to the contrary, these subject areas are becoming increasingly complex. And so there is still a need to specialize within each of those different specific disciplines.
Is there a need for a multidisciplinary approach?
For new energy projects, that requires having a cross-disciplinary team of experts across all of those different areas to make sure that the clients are obtaining seamless and coordinated legal advice across all areas of what is now coined energy law.
So that was Sander Duncanson, partner with Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Thank you for joining us and explaining more about the work you do.